It's the starting.
You look good, buddy.
What? I fixed my hair?
You're fixing your hair.
Well, I need a cut. I'll do this. I'll be talking, and I'll do this.
I'm sorry you guys have to see
And
this.
Sarah goes, "You can't take your hat off in public." I'm like, "I don't." She goes, "You did during group. You just take your hat off." And she's like, "You think you have this flowing hair? You just have this."
My wife never worries about that. She's like, "It looks good."
My 4-year-old Colby goes, "Daddy, why does your hair go up?"
I love your kids, man. That's good.
All right, we are in chapter 3 of the series.
Yeah.
We're spending a little bit of time in the Old Testament, which we're going to get to Christmas here at Christmas. So we're
Merry
not
Christmas.
like going to be in the Old Testament for a year. We're doing the whole story of God, and then we'll probably circle back to some of these different stories. But sometimes a lot of people, I've heard different people, different conversations with folks. Obviously, we're Christians. We're part of the church, New Testament. Easier to understand what's going on many times. You start to get into the Old Testament. There's great old stories. There's parts like, now what's going on here? There's a lot of names, a lot of lists, different culture, different time, all these different things. So it can be different. Before we jump into a couple Old Testament questions, you got a favorite Old Testament story?
Favorite Old Testament story? Well, I'm tempted to say in the book of Judges, there's a story about Ehud, the left-handed judge.
Garrett did a sermon on that one.
Yeah, and I like that story. When my wife and I were in Indiana before we were pastoring or anything like that, we were at a church, and we started a children's ministry there, and we took them through the book of Judges, and we would act it out
Was that
with
your
them.
idea?
It was like awesome, and I just remember that story. Ehud, the left-handed judge. Look it up; you'll like it too. I think the favorite Old Testament story, I really like the book of Daniel, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Not just because it's my name, but I just
Didn't
think
think about that.
there's some powerful things in there. So that might be it. Yeah. How about yours?
I think Daniel is one of, like, you always hear about heroes of the faith, Hebrews 11, and then you read the stories, and you're like, none of them are heroes. Daniel's the only one that passes his year. Like, he's kept it together. Daniel's good. Oh, man, I asked you the question. I didn't think about it. I just taught on Exodus.
Yeah.
And I do think it's just a great story.
It is.
I like, I think Moses is one of my favorites because there's so much with Moses and the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so Moses, he doesn't get to go in the promised land. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And he has to convince the Lord, seemingly, to change his mind. Like, you just see a lot of relational stuff with them. So that's fun.
You did a great job, too. If you didn't get a chance to listen to that, listen to it. But it did a great job.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
You heard it here. You heard it here.
You heard it here.
There's some gnarly stories in the Old Testament.
Yeah, there's some tough stories. And it can lead, I think one of the things we're going to talk about, it can lead people to a wrong assumption about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And there's several, I think, wrong assumptions that people have. But one being the God of the Old Testament seems different than the God of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Have you heard that?
It feels like Jesus is loving everybody, and kissing kids on the forehead, making bread.
It's like a groovy hippie with feathered hair.
Yeah, and then you read the Old Testament, you're like, well, that feels different.
Yeah, he seems like a drill sergeant, or he's like out for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I got asked once, is the God of the Old Testament the same as the God of the New Testament? By somebody in the parking lot, and that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
So the short answer to that, I mean, we can just talk about it, is yes.
Yeah.
He is.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, well, why does he seem this way in the Old Testament and not so much this way in the New? And I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
Obviously there's way more complexities to that answer. I think the simple answers to that would be this. I think when you look at the God of the Old Testament and you think, man, he seems mean, and the God of the New Testament seems loving and kind, there's several things I would say about that. One is I think it's easy to read the Old Testament with a predisposed lens and miss the love of God in the Old Testament. In fact, you did a great job bringing that out this week, I thought, in the story of the Exodus, that Exodus 34 talks about his compassion and so on and so forth. And so when you read the Old Testament and miss the love of God, which is all through there, it's because somehow there's a predisposed, and there is some tough stuff in there.
Sure.
But I think the same is true the opposite. I think sometimes we can read the New Testament, and if you read the New Testament with these predisposed, God is love and he's kind, everybody peace, and this, that, and everything, I think you misread the New Testament. For instance, in the New Testament, Jesus is the one that that in his first sermon says, well, you guys have heard it said, and he just ups the rim. He ups it.
Yeah.
He's like, but I say, and it's like, well, okay, it's not all like. And then when you keep reading in this thing, you see Acts in the book of Acts, these guys lie, and bam, they're dead.
Yep.
They said we brought our offering, and they didn't bring all that they said they brought, and God's like, over. Like, aren't we kind of glad that doesn't happen today, right? And then you read Jesus, and I think I'm correct on this, and we can check me on it, but I think Jesus talks about hell like a gob.
Yeah, we're uncomfortable with that. And like, he's the one talking about it. Yeah.
And then when you read the New Testament, like, you got to go clear to the end.
Yeah.
And see how the story ends. It's like, and so I think when you can read the Old New with predisposed, and maybe there's some focuses and emphasis that are such and such.
Yeah.
But here's the worry. If you're like, I like the God of the New Testament because he's loving and kind, then you really don't know the God of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Because he is not as loving in your mind as he really is unless you see how holy and righteous and just he is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see what I'm saying? And vice versa.
Yeah.
And so he's the same God. And I think it's just a matter of realizing there's different emphasis at different places. There's some confusing Old Testament passages. Let's just say that.
Sure.
It's like, what?
And that can deter us. I almost think of, we always want like, hey, why is the Old Testament God meaner than the new one? And you're like, oh, well, that's because I always think of like a grid, or like if there's like a window I'm going to climb through, what are like the different sides of the window? It's a terrible analogy, but it's the one that's always in my head. And it's the first time I've said it out loud. It doesn't make any sense. One, like, I just think about when you look at the Bible, sometimes we're not always sure like the time. Like when we look at the New Testament, it's still historical, but it's like a couple thousand years, Roman history. Like we've got artifacts. We've got cities. Pastor Adam and I got to go to, sorry you couldn't come with us. He had a knee surgery. Yeah. But we went to some of these cities. You can go see the stuff, and there's still stuff that looks like stuff. You're like, here's the picture of the early church, whatever. Where when you go back further and further into the Old Testament, there's more and more of just cultural things to navigate. So you led us through Abraham with Genesis 15. You're like, what's happening here? Well, once some of that cultural stuff breaks down, you're like, well, that's a beautiful picture. So there's more like a cultural gap sometimes that we have to navigate. Now, why did God do this? I think sometimes the culture we're reading it from is different. Why did God smite his enemies? Or why did God, that seems cruel. Easy to say when I don't really have to worry about my enemies at all ever. I don't live in fear. I didn't watch my tribe be taken out by an enemy, and God being just in those ways doesn't resonate with me as a guy who lives with air conditioning. So there's cultural gaps that I'm missing reading into it.
There's cultural gaps, and if you wind this thing clear back to the beginning of the story, no one who reads it with a fair, open mind would blame God for just shutting the book on the whole experiment by Genesis 11.
Yeah.
And so anything after Genesis 11 where you see God pursuing and his grace and is just an act of grace and kindness, because like you're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wonder why he doesn't just shut the book on the whole thing. And then the other thing I think to myself is when we read the Bible, it's like stories happen and they're a few pages apart, and they don't allow for the reader sometimes, if he's not reading alert, to realize that those few pages may represent hundreds of years, and that the people you're reading about, like, wonder why that town, they don't take into consideration those people. Like, for instance, the Canaanites. You read about them in the Old Testament. It's like, well, you read some scholarly works on them.
It's gnarly folks.
It's some bad stuff going on. And so his patience, it looks like he's a quick-triggered God.
Yeah.
No way when you read it. It's like those pages represent a long-suffering and patient God who's pursuing people, and but yet he's holy and he's just. And at times he uses the Israelites to execute some of that justice. At times he uses the Babylonians to execute it upon his own people, and we're going to get there in a week or two.
Yeah. Yeah, you see the patience of God. And there's something, too, to Jesus is the full revelation of God. The Bible tells us that when we think of God, who we think of, we look to Jesus. We believe the Old Testament because Jesus believed the Old Testament.
Exactly.
Like Jesus affirmed, quoted, fulfilled, grew up on, lived by the Old Testament. And so for me to be like, I don't like the original work that you were missing something there. And there's something to, I tell people this all the time. When I read the Old Testament, if there's a story that I'm like, well, that seems, sometimes I pull exclamation mark and I'll keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's things that I don't know, I don't understand, things that I might be missing culturally, things that I emotionally might not comprehend because who I am, where I'm at, whatever. What I do know is that God bled for us in our place on the cross. And that's the thing I know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can put a question mark and circle back to that. Maybe it'll be my whole life until that starts to pop in a different way, or I understand it in the context of the whole story.
I think that is well said, Aiden. I heard a guy say it this way one time. He said, the cross and the story of the cross, Christ crucified, buried, rose again, is like the wallpaper on your computer when you read the Bible. It's like the backdrop of everything. And he said, keep reading.
Yeah,
and
keep reading.
You said, I think you meant a question mark or an exclamation point.
That's an exclamation.
You did? Okay. Yeah. Whatever.
That's my code for me when I'm reading.
Yeah, star, whatever. But keep reading. Sometimes you get, like, people stop. I'm like, I got to get that all figured out. And I would keep reading. And it's amazing as you keep reading and then do that year after year after year, all of a sudden some of those things kind of against the backdrop of the cross begin to, you see the ribbon. I think this might fold into something else we're going to say. I heard, and I think, and I'm sorry if this is not the person who said it, I think it was Tim Keller's wife, Kathy Keller, said this, that if you preach on the Old Testament and don't get to Jesus, you simply taught, and this is not, I'm not trying to be offensive here, but you simply have taught a Sunday school lesson that has taught on principles, and you've not taught it against the backdrop of what the whole story is about. And so somehow, if you read the Old Testament and you read about that God and he seems mean and confusing, keep reading, because here's what John 1 says. When Jesus came, he was the complete, perfect explanation of God.
Yeah.
And so as you read the Old Testament, it somehow points to Jesus. There's this like scarlet ribbon, one author put it that way, that just, it's a road that leads to Jesus. And so if there's confusing points, it's okay to put a question mark beside it, put a star beside it. It's like, I don't know. I don't get that. But somehow that thing is driving me to Jesus. It's not just a principle I'm supposed to learn. Like, am I supposed to go out and do that? But somehow this whole thing is, and I'm going to assume there's something I don't know, or maybe something that the revelation of Christ in the New Testament is going to help me know. And then maybe there's a lot that we get to heaven, I'll look you up, you look me up, and it's like, I don't know, God, help me make sense of that.
My angel will call your angel.
That's right.
Your angel's going to be like, he had enough of him on earth.
I know this, man. If we go anywhere in heaven, I'm driving. All right? I'm just saying.
I was talking to someone, Dan did a picture a couple weeks ago of us AI in a car. Everyone I talked to, they're like, you did that for him? I said, that was all him. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, he figured it out on his own. I don't know. And then I was also talking to my friend Brandon. He's like, I bet there's a lot of people who didn't realize that was AI. That were just like, what's that weird circular car that you were in?
I think people are shocked that I even know what AI is and how to use it. But yeah.
I think people would be surprised at your technical acumen in certain areas. Not in all areas. Hey, you kind of said this, but I felt this teaching a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I actually am really comforted. There's a couple times in the scriptures, I believe it's the Psalms, where the author says, this is too wonderful for me. Like, there's things that are just feels like this is above my pay grade kind of thing. And sometimes you read, you taught through Abraham, you're like, here's the original promise, zoom in on this man, look at the stars, you count on, it's this huge promise, huge thing. And then we read it, and you're like, cool, glad that God made this giant promise to this guy. That's an amazing story. It connects. Amazing. But I got to get this test done in 15 minutes. Like, it can be easy to feel lost in the bigness of the Old Testament, the history of it, the grandeur of it, the epicness of the Exodus. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes our temptation is to say, so what Red Sea is God going to split in your life? Mm-hmm. A financial Red Sea? A medical Red Sea? Mm-hmm. A relational Red Sea? And what's the Goliath in your life? Mm-hmm. Everybody knows Goliath and David because of sports. You know,
that's the coaching thing, man. We're David. There's Goliath.
Did you make that joke recently? Like,
I would never do.
All the coaches know that story. What would your encouragement be to us as we read these stories to not be dismissive because they feel too ancient, epic, big, and disconnected from my life, but also not to turn them into a principle-based fairy tale or principle-based. Here's a lesson, so dare to be a Daniel. What would you say to someone?
Yeah, well, my best shot at that is like I think you read like when you read the Old Testament stories, read them as understanding they're real people.
Yeah.
So let them be real. That's the first thing I would say. So the minute you put them on a plateau they're not meant to be, all of a sudden it's like superheroes, and that's not all what they are. And I think just like you're reading history, there's things to be learned for people. So I read a book about Abraham Lincoln. There's things to be learned, and I'm reading the Bible about David, and I'm like, there's things to be learned. Like here's this guy, and it's like God's calling his life, and there's things to be learned. I don't think there's no place for that.
Sure.
Daniel praying in this foreign culture, Daniel rising to influence and knowing not to isolate, not to assimilate, but to influence and infiltrate. All that. There's things to learn. I think when I read it, maybe that's the best way. When I read it, I think for me, I'm going to use your example. I grew up learning that song. You ever heard that song, Dare to be Daniel?
I heard the title, but I don't know if I remember.
Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to make a purpose firm, dare to yada, yada, yada.
Do they rap it like that?
Yeah, like that. And I will sing it someday for you. But I think for me, because I'm preaching on Daniel in 2 weeks, and I think for me, it's more like when I read it, I want to find and know about the God of Daniel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that makes all the difference. So we're going to preach about Abraham. No, we're going to preach about the God of Abraham.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to preach about Moses. Well, Moses makes me feel good because, he was a justice guy in Egypt. And so he took a guy out because he was mistreating a Hebrew brother.
Yeah.
And then he runs because he's like, my life's in danger. And then he gets real comfortable with his life in the desert, and then God shakes it up, and he's like, I don't want to do that. I don't think I'm the guy to do that. I'm not qualified to do that, right? And you see Moses, he's got, like, there's just stuff, And yet the God of Moses, when you read it that way, and I think of that with David and Daniel and these guys. And so if I can make that my primary, like, I want to know, what is this telling me about the God of Daniel, God of David? Then it's going to tell me why Daniel prayed 3 times a day. Because he believed that about that God.
Yeah.
He stood in front of the most powerful man on the planet who had quite an ask of him. Said, tell me what I dreamed and what it means.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to cut you all to pieces. I'm like, well, that's a good day. And he says, I can't, but God can.
Yeah.
And I think these guys are like, it's the God of these guys. And I think the other thing when you read is to realize sometimes our favorite stories are the ones that ended well. Moses didn't get in the promised land.
Yeah.
Daniel hung out in exile from 15 to like 87 or something like that. It's like, and you read the book of Hebrews chapter 11, not everybody saw the
That's
fruit
my
of
favorite. I said it last week. I'm going to say it again.
Say it again.
Preach
it.
That they didn't get to see the.
Mm-hmm.
We want to see the end of it. We want it all to make sense. That's how I become a Daniel. Oh, that's how because I'm trying to. The main thing is his character formation, which is important, but not the God of the God that's forming the character in us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happens when the Red Sea doesn't part? What happens when whatever the Red Sea is?
Yeah.
And the same God.
Right.
The same God. And so I think for me, the big thing I do is like when I read this, I think there's things to be learned from these guys. They were real guys. Just like I learned real guys. And so Hebrews 11 seems to say by faith, somehow it's pointing to their faith.
Yeah.
And their faith was in the God that they followed. So what does the story say about their God is what I would say.
Yeah. It's been fun to go through these stories. We're going to hit some of these big names through the Old Testament. Come with Christmas. It's all pointing to Jesus. He fulfills all of this. We'll probably circle back, get back in the Old Testament here next year.
Yeah, I think it's good to know, like, if you're coming and hanging out and enjoying these, that our goal in this, obviously we're skipping lots of stuff, is just to put hooks.
Yeah.
So that if we go back, it's like I can hang that hook there.
Yeah.
And I kind of have the story. And so, hopefully it's helping those of you who are enjoying. If you haven't, just hopefully go check it out. But yeah, I agree. It's been a lot of fun.
It's good.
Peace out.